All right, so I'm here with Houston Chandler, who is the Director of Science at the Orianne Society, a nonprofit organization that works primarily with the conservation of herp species. So first, I'd like to ask Houston broadly, what does that position entail?
So this is actually a somewhat new position for Orianne. So like you mentioned, we do conservation of rare reptiles and amphibians, and we've always been a science-based organization. So we like to do science and then inform on the ground management using the best available science. And so what my job entails really is making sure that we're making good science decisions. So when we go out and do research projects, it's my job to make sure they're designed well, that we can answer the questions that we need to answer to better conserve these rare species, and then to make sure ultimately that things get published and that other people can learn from the work that we're doing. So really on a day-to-day, I'm just overseeing our science and making sure everything runs smoothly and that we get the answers that we need to get.
All right. So could you tell me a little bit about your education and what led you to that position, like any prior experience you had?
Yeah, so I had this, I guess, somewhat typical background in this kind of ecology conservation field. I did my undergrad at Georgia College in Milledgeville, Georgia, and then went on to Virginia Tech to get a master's degree. And then I worked around at Virginia Tech for about a year after that. And then I was hired on at Orianne, actually another position. And then as things have changed over the years, this new position for director of science kind of came out of some of the plans that we had at Orianne. And so I moved over to do that, and I'm actually a PhD student right now at Virginia Tech. So working on a PhD while working for Orianne at the same time. So that's somewhat a novel thing for most people, but yeah, it's been fun doing a PhD and working at the same time.
Right. So what species and habitats do you primarily work with?
We work with a lot of things. We have programs in all the way from the southeastern United States up to the northeast, and have had international programs over the years and all kinds of different things. We're known for working with Eastern Indigo Snakes. That's kind of how people often find us and what they know about us. We work a lot in longleaf pine ecosystems, which is where you can find indigo snakes. But we also work with a lot of different other species. So we work a lot with freshwater turtles, things like spotted turtles, alligator snapping turtles. And then our northeastern program is designed a lot around wood turtle conservation. And so when you get into doing herp work up in the northeast, it's a really different animal than it is doing stuff in the southeast. So it's been cool to see the growth in that program over the last couple of years.
Yeah, so in the southeast with the indigo snake, I'd like to know how much of the conservation with them is ex situ conservation?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Indigo snakes, they're kind of weird. So they have kind of this multifaceted conservation program. And so I'll back up a little bit. Indigo snakes have been federally listed as threatened since 1978. So they've been now imperiled for over 40 years. There's been all kinds of conservation programs and projects with indigo snakes, and they're still imperiled, and their status is kind of somewhat up in the air. But one of the things that's come out of the indigo snake work that's not really typical for a lot of species, that there's been a lot of work on captive breeding. So you have all the work that takes place in the field. So we do all the typical things. We monitor populations. We do habitat management. But then there's also this other piece where we spend a lot of time raising snakes and releasing babies back into the field in places in their range where they've been extirpated. So indigo snakes have this really cool story of where you're getting a mix of both in the field conservation with extant populations, and then you're also getting this kind of captive rearing part of it coming in to try to boost the number of populations in the wild. So it's a really cool conservation story.
So when you're working with them in the wild, are you mostly working on private land or public land?
We do some of both. We try. So we work primarily in the field in southern Georgia. We try really hard to reach out to private landowners, especially ones obviously that have snakes on their property, to both educate them about snakes and also to help them do things like burn their woods and manage the habitat. So we do a lot of outreach and work with private landowners, but we do work a lot on state properties too. To do any broad scale conservation like that, you have to work across multiple multiple ownerships on these types of properties.
Mm. And are there any like specific obstacles you found with working with private lands?
Yeah, private lands are interesting for many different reasons, I guess. So one of the things is you have to be able to talk to people and make sure you're on the same page with people when you're on their property. So we often work with indigo snakes during hunting season, so we have to make sure that we're keeping people happy and not interfering with their hunting or not getting just making sure that we're respectful of them letting us on their property. Some of the other issues are kind of broader scale, that since they're private properties, the landowners have the ultimate say about what happens on that property. So you can advise them on what the best thing to do for the snakes would be, or for any other species that they're interested in. But at the end of the day, they're making decisions, and their decisions, often based on monetary issues, may not line up to your conservation issues. So you have to just find a way to make the best case scenario of that and find a way to work with them to achieve conservation goals.
All right. And regarding public and private, I noticed you also worked with the the Department of Natural Resources, right? And
Yep.
Are there any major differences you noticed in working with a government organization versus a private organization like the Orianne Society?
Yeah, so I've never worked for a agency, but I spent a lot of time working with people who work for agencies, and there's definitely a lot of differences. For one thing, working with agencies, there's a lot more rules that they kind of have to follow, and it's a bit stricter on how things function than working with a nonprofit like Orianne. Um, in general, we all have more or less the same goals. But of course, working with the state, especially on their properties, again, just like private properties, they have the ultimate say in the end on what goes on with those properties. So working as a nonprofit, we like to work with a lot of people and work on a lot of different properties and help conservation as much as we can, but we have very little authority when it comes to regulation and ultimately making decisions that are on other properties that we don't own. So you really do have to work with a lot of different people to accomplish these goals.
Would you say that is that's the most challenging part of your job, working with other people, or is there anything else that you'd say?
Yes and no. I mean, there's always people that are difficult to work with. I think that's the case in any field, and so it's no different than anything else, really. I don't know. I enjoy working with other people. I enjoy getting out and hearing other perspectives on these issues, especially from people who own land and have these animals on their land. It's nice to hear what they think about it. All in all, doing the actual math behind the science is probably the hardest thing that I do. But yeah, field work is challenging, often physically, but it's fun in the end.
Yeah. What's your most rewarding part of the job? Is that the field work, you think?
Yeah, so field work is the most fun for sure. I think it's why everybody gets interested in this field originally, is going out and seeing animals and catching animals. For me, since I do a lot of the back end stuff, writing papers and things like that, I enjoy when our work actually makes it out and gets published so that other people can see it. I think that's rewarding for me, and that's a big part of what we try to do, being a science-based organization.
Right. Do you have any advice for someone who would want to go into work with this and work in the wildlife field?
Yeah, the wildlife field is tricky, to say the least. It's highly competitive, and there's a lot. I mean, it depends really on what you want to do. I think that's some of the best advice is to figure out what kind of job you want ultimately. So doing science like I do is very different from doing land management like some of the people that work for Orianne do. So if you can figure out kind of what path you want to go down and whether you want to be a scientist or whether you'd like to work for an agency or set the woods on fire doing land management, there's slight nuances and different things you need to do for those different goals. So I think you really should try to identify what you enjoy and what you want to do. Most things in the wildlife field require some school, whether that's just a BS or all the way up to an MS or PhD. So you got to go to school, at least some, probably.
Yeah, that's it for questions. So thanks for talking with me. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, happy to do it.
Yep.